I may have to do this video again because naturally, as soon as I finished setting up these decks, the wind started changing direction, and I intentionally did it on this side of the shop to stay away from the wind, and obviously it's windy. What I've done is I've laid out a series of decks for basically from John Deere garden tractors, I guess back to 66 all the way to present. So what we're staring at right now is the current 54 high capacity deck that would come on the X series. It's been out since 2013. I'm just going to quickly walk down this line and go through what each deck is, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about some of the finer points of the deck itself. So, like I said, this is a 54 HC high capacity deck that's on the current X series. This right here is a 60-inch 7-iron deck. For the X series, it was out. Realistically, this deck was available from 06 all the way up to 2012. That is a 54C deck, or a 54 edge deck, whatever you want to call it. That was out on machines from 2002 moving forward up through 2012 on the X series. These two decks are 425, 445, 455 decks. We have a 54-inch deck here, and then we have a 60-inch deck in the back. The 60-inch deck generally was a pretty popular deck, pretty robust. This deck right here is a 60-inch deck that would have been found on a 420 or 430. To back up just really quick, these two decks were basically out from 1993 all the way up to 2001 when Deere switched to the X series. This deck right here is a 60-inch deck. It was found on the 420 and the 430. The garden tractors that were available, the 420 was available from 1983 all the way up to 1992. The 430 was available from 1983 or 1984 all the way up to 1992. This deck right here is of the same era. However, this is a 46-inch deck for a 318. And then I went ahead, just for fun, I pulled out a model 48 deck, or model 47. I can't remember the model number. This is off of a 112 round fender, so it's even got the round fender draft plates on it. Clearly I don't use it. So that's how, to look back up this line right here, these are all of the major styles of Deere decks for super garden tractors. So I want to come back up. Actually, we'll start down here. We'll talk about the design. So in 1966, when John Deere came out with their 112 garden tractor, it was supposed to be a step above the 110 because it had 10 horsepower instead of 8 horsepower. So they come out with a bigger deck, and I didn't feel like getting down any of my Model 36 decks from the shelf in the shop. So this deck came out in 1966 and was specifically designed for the 112s. Now you could put it under a 110, I would suppose. However, there are a couple design things that make this deck a little bit different in terms of it's a double belted deck off the PTO, whereas the 36-inch deck was a single belted deck. But this overall design kind of stuck with Deere all the way up through the 1980s. There were some minor changes in spindles, pulleys, things like that, but the overall deck shell design, if you look at this deck from 1966, you're going to see a lot of the same design features as the deck from 1966 and this deck that was probably built late 80s based on the serial tag on it. So this is a 46-inch deck off of a 318. Obviously, some gauge wheels have been added, but the overall stamp of the deck has not changed much. So there wasn't a whole lot of differences in the deck. I mean, you can look at 140 decks, and there's some other decks that came on the 140, like a 41-inch deck, and a couple other things that really the architecture is the same. And really, the architecture is the same on this 60-inch deck off of a 420, 430. I mean, you see it's the same swooping design that the Deere really used this design, but this was the first taller deck. If you go and look at pictures, unfortunately, I don't have a 400 deck here. If you go look at a John Deere 400 deck, 1975 or 74, until 1982, something like that. If you go look at a 400 deck, what you're going to see is it's a much shallower deck. So the overall depth, the capacity is not necessarily what this 60-inch deck was here. But it is important to note that the John Deere 400s did come with a 60-inch deck, so this wasn't John Deere's first 60-inch deck. The 400s also it was the first gear-driven deck. So up until this point, all the decks were belt-driven off of some type of mule drive that transferred the direction of the motor, the power takeoff on the engine to the deck. This was the first one, even though it was belt-driven, the pulley was belt-driven off the front of the engine. This was the first gear case on a deck, so it was just a drive shaft. It wasn't necessarily a pulley and a belt that powered this deck right here. These are strictly my opinions. This deck, the 60-inch deck that came on the 425, 445, 455, and the 7-iron deck off the early X series are quite possibly some of the best decks that John Deere ever built for garden tractors. They have, obviously, there's some wicked decks for zero turns and stuff like that nowadays, but I think that overall this deck right here does an amazing job cutting. For the technology that was available at the time, it's just a big, heavy, robust deck. Deere made a couple changes, and one of the big changes between the 420 430s and the 4-5 series was the PTO, the mid PTO for the machine itself. So one of the big ways that you can tell these decks right here, apart from 60-inch decks that came on the later machines, aside from the plastic covers, because the early ones had metal covers, just like this one right here. But look at the direction of the PTO shaft. This PTO shaft points forward. It's coming towards the mid shaft and coming off of the PTO on the engine. Meanwhile, this deck right here, the PTO shaft is pointing backwards, which comes off the transmission of the tractor. That is the difference between the electromagnetic PTO and the 420 430 and the K91 transaxle with the wet clutch PTO on the 4-5 series. Oftentimes what people will ask is they will ask, well, how can I switch these two decks? You probably could with a little bit of work. There's a couple minor differences. One is the front mounts. The front mounts are quite a bit different, so those would have to be replaced. You'd have to expand, depending on which way you're going, you have to narrow or expand the back draft hangers, and you would have to flip that case around going the other way. Now, I don't necessarily know how it would handle the speed input shaft wise. I'm not quite sure about the gear cases and everything, so that's a whole different discussion. One of the things that Deere did do, there's a couple differences, I guess, to reduce manufacturing cost. Some of the gussets that are on this deck, like that front weldment right there, make sure you can see this. So those two plates right there, they are no longer present on the newer decks, and also that caster wheel became just a single wheel that is the bane of a lot of people's existence on trying to get this deck underneath the machine. If you're trying to get this deck underneath the machine and you're trying to slide it, that wheel over there creates all kinds of problems. At the same time, they didn't necessarily need those weldments anymore because of the deck attached. I'm trying to keep you out of the wind. I'm sorry about the wind, but I spent an hour getting all these decks out because I had this idea for this video. I may have to do a voiceover or something. But anyway, this deck is very, very similar to the older 420 430 deck. Now, when Deere came out with it was the later 200 series, so like the 265, stuff like that, they started building these. Originally it was a 48-inch style deck. This is a 54, much lighter gauge deck. A lot of people like them for getting in. This deck came in both 48 and 54-inch styles. Used on lots and lots of machines. Depending on the model, there were a few differences in the weldments on them and stuff like that, and how they attached to the machine. But this deck right here was pretty much classic across, 345s, the 200 series, like 285s, 320s, things like that. They were all, even the 48-inch replacement deck for the 318 was very similar architecture to this deck right here. So there's just something to keep in mind. A lot of people like these decks. However, when you start looking at them in terms of capacity, they are nowhere near the capacity of that deck in the back. And I'm not necessarily just saying because of width. I'm saying because of depth of the deck. That deck is a lot deeper. It's going to handle more grass in the air in the deck compared to this one. So then we're going to step forward. Stepping forward, first really big change in Deere decks in a long time. So this is a 54 deck off of an X series, and if you look, hopefully you can see some of the changes here. There's some really big radical changes. Now, if I flip this deck over, which I don't necessarily think I have time to do, but if I flipped this deck over, what you're going to see is overall very similar shape, but you're going to see that this curve right here is not as pronounced on this deck as it is on this one. So this deck right here is a higher capacity deck than the previous 54. These decks, a lot of people love them. They also came in a 62-inch size. That was pretty much the John Deere garden tractor deck for the X series, aside from the 7-iron, which we'll get into here in just a second. One of the big, I hate to say problems, but one of the big things with this deck is this is the first time you really see Deere go with a bigger deck. It does not necessarily have some of the refined features that you were used to. It doesn't necessarily have some of the heft that some of the older decks had while they're still larger. This deck just looks bigger than this 54-inch deck. Most of that's that weldment in the back, but it is a higher capacity deck. I haven't put a tape measure on it or anything, but I can just tell you that it's overall higher capacity. In 2006, with the release of the X7s away from the X5-5s and 4-5s, X7s came out, and shortly after, the 7-iron deck came out. The 7-iron deck actually was originally a commercial deck. It is 7-gauge steel. One of the thickest decks out there in the market is a stamped deck. If you want a really cool read and some videos, you can look up how they make these things. It is a huge press that makes these things. I mean, you're punching 7-gauge steel. As I said, this deck right here is quite possibly between this deck and those older 60-inch decks back there, the pinnacle of cut quality for John Deere garden tractors. Absolutely love this deck. High capacity. If you look at it, it's just straight back, and if you look underneath it, it's all straight. So there's lots of capacity in there. You know, it's just fantastic. I can't say enough good things about this deck right here. It is expensive. It was very expensive when it came out compared to the 54 deck, so not a lot of people got them. They don't necessarily fit straight on the older X5-5, 4-5 tractors. That is because this deck is so deep that it actually requires different mounts, and on the later X series, they put 2 mounts that you actually have to move the draft arms up into the frame a little bit. But if you look at the depth on this one, it's clearly a nice deep deck. You know, like I said, just the overall design, it's robust. It's a commercial service deck. This was really the first drive over deck. I've had a couple people comment in recent videos and in past videos, well, you can just drive over those. If you want to, you can. 6 of one, half dozen of the other to you. I just lift it up with the tractor because I have it. And so then we're going to fast forward from this deck to the 54 high capacity deck. 54 high capacity and the 60 high capacity decks are the 2 decks that are available on the garden tractors now. They've had some problems with these decks in terms of design. You know, some of the quick attach systems that they have for these decks, they're wearing out, and I'll show you that here in just a second. So I'm not necessarily saying all these decks are the greatest things since sliced bread. But overall, capacity-wise, this is very similar in shape and design to that deck right over there. It's just 54 inches instead of 60. It's still very robust. It has very similar pulleys and setups to the older deck. I think the biggest thing with this deck is it's just smaller. So now what I want to do, now that I've kind of covered all of our decks here and the progression of decks from the 60s up through to the current series, I want to show you a couple others and a couple other issues. So I really wanted to quick show you a 50-inch deck of a 318. If you compare that to the 46 I was showing you in the earlier video, you see the swooped front edge. This was Deere's really kind of, my opinion, its first good attempt at a higher capacity deck compared to what the 46-inch deck was. Everybody seems to really like this deck, aside from, there's their favorite deck for a 318, 322, 332, aside from the 48-inch replacement deck. But I just wanted to show you that shape difference in this deck versus that older 46. So one of the things that on these newer high capacity decks that some folks are having trouble with, others don't have any trouble at all, is these mounting tabs right here, as I was saying when I was doing the video. And if you compare this to an older 7-iron deck, you can kind of tell where they cut the corner on this. I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad idea, because a lot of people seem to be very satisfied, very happy, and at the same time it keeps the cost of the machine lower. And before we get into discussion cost on this, first off, I have no idea how many hours on these 3 decks right here. They're all pretty much worn out and going to scrap, but I think that this one right here is probably the best. This one's okay, it's just got a couple wear places on it. But one thing I want to note is in 1963 you could get a 8 horsepower garden tractor with a 36-inch deck that was gear driven with a variable speed for the equivalent of almost $10,000 in today's money. Today, for $13,000, you can more or less get a diesel, 4-wheel drive, hydrostatically driven garden tractor with a 54-inch deck for the $13,000. So you've added $3,000 for all-wheel drive, a diesel engine, and a much larger deck. So just think of all that in comparison before somebody says, well, you know, things used to be built better. Well, yeah, maybe. In some respects, yes. But you know what? If I'm going to do dirt work, I'm going to much prefer to be in that than a 1971 4020. But anyway, so to come over here to show you how the difference between these 7-iron decks, how they mounted. You have these tabs right here, and then they just mount to these tabs. And so this is why you didn't necessarily see that problem in the 7-irons compared to the high capacity decks that are currently out there. So hopefully that video was helpful and informative. But these are all the decks, and I apologize for the way, like I said, I got all these out and then it got windy and the wind changed directions. So thanks for watching.